Angie here with Prosper Sustainably. Today I'm here talking with Sam Hartnett. Sam is a senior associate at Rocky Mountain Institute based in Colorado, and we're here today to talk about how blockchain technology can be applied to help support clean energy and transportation goals here in Hawaii and all over the world. We're really fortunate because Sam is an expert and is working on the front lines in this field. So welcome, Sam, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So we're here at the Green Biz VERGE Hawaii Conference, which is a clean energy summit happening in Honolulu. And yesterday I attended your session on blockchain, which was really fascinating. Lots of wonky information, but I love that. I found it exciting. Can you tell my audience a little bit about what the topic was you were asked to speak about?
Sure. So the title of the workshop was Blockchain for Energy 101. And it's sometimes a daunting topic because the energy world is super complicated and hard to understand. The blockchain world is definitely super complicated and hard to understand. And when you start to put them together, one and one doesn't necessarily equal two. It becomes really difficult to wrap your head around it. So my intent was to come in and try to cut through the jargon and the hype and just talk in practical terms. What is this technology and why should we care about it in the energy sector, and what are some potential use cases that might be relevant, particularly for Hawaii's energy transition?
I couldn't agree more about the complexity. I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of blockchain and a good understanding of energy. When you put them together, there's almost endless opportunities, but you did such a good job of sharing with people some of the analogies that help them really understand why blockchain might be an essential piece of evolving towards a more decentralized energy market or economy. Can you share one or two of those analogies that can help people wrap their heads around all this?
Yeah, so my favorite analogy is thinking about the history of the ice trade. And I kind of started by talking about how there's this natural evolution for all types of industries where markets start locally, they eventually become consolidated around a handful of participants and quite centralized, and then eventually become fully decentralized again and return to this local market structure. So with respect to ice, there's some interesting history where a bunch of entrepreneurs in the northeastern US in the 19th century began harvesting blocks of ice from local bodies of water and distributing it to regional cities ranging from Washington, D.C. up to Boston. And demand for this product grew quite quickly. You can imagine in a world with no refrigeration or central air, having ice in the summer in particular was a really lovely thing to experience. And so this trade grew pretty quickly, but by the early 20th century, the local harvesters were essentially replaced by the invention of centralized air compression and refrigeration technology. And so suddenly, ice was being manufactured by the ton in large factories and controlled by what were called at the time ice tycoons. And they really controlled the whole market. But in 1925 came the invention of the in-home electric refrigerator. And by 1945, refrigeration was widespread throughout the country, and ice production became essentially fully decentralized, and we've seen this continue to today. And large-scale ice manufacturing is kind of a niche industry, and people now have the ability to produce it on their own terms. And so I draw the analogy to the energy sector because we're seeing the early stages of consumers increasingly choosing technologies that enable them to produce and consume electricity on their own terms, produce it locally, and produce it independently at a price that is competitive with the traditional generation and infrastructure of the past. So I consider us kind of at the point of the invention of the refrigerator, and we're seeing the early stages of this decentralization.
And your theory really is that markets tend to always trend towards decentralization over time as technology supports that progression. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's a lot of examples. I looked at the history of pop music, where you went from a world of local tradition to the centralized recording industry to suddenly the streaming era,
Right.
or to go further back, information, where everything was local oral tradition. Then we had the great libraries and a handful of institutions and control, and then we had the printing press and mass adoption of books. So this plays out in many different contexts, and there's two things that really enable this transition. The first is there needs to be advance in the technology that delivers that product or service, such that individuals are able to produce it, on their own terms at a reasonable cost. But the second thing that is really important is there needs to be this underlying infrastructure that can support this new technology. So for the case of ice, electricity and widespread electrification was a prerequisite for in-home refrigerators. For the streaming era in music, the internet is a prerequisite to deliver those services. So to kind of bring it back to the energy space, we see blockchain as this technology that can serve as an underlying infrastructure to better coordinate and operate all of these distributed energy resources that consumers are increasingly choosing.
Right, and I think maybe it's probably useful for our listeners who are generally going to be sustainability officials, energy and environmental analysts, maybe a resiliency officer, and some other types of community leaders. They're going to be really new to the concept of blockchain. Maybe we start just with the definition, and it gets easier to understand the more you learn about it, but then the jargon starts, because you understand the jargon, but even that jargon, things like a ledger, don't always compute for people right away. Mm-hmm. So what's the most basic way that you explain, what blockchain is?
Yeah, I like to think of blockchain in the history of computers. And just to be really clear and really simple, a blockchain is a new form of computing. It is a computer network, right? So if you go back through history, you start with hardware, and the first computers are super complicated, massive pieces of equipment that only a few people can operate, but they let you store some information and perform some basic functions. But then we have software come along, and now software makes it much easier to use a computer. You can perform much more sophisticated tasks, and so you're at this point now where you don't actually care what physical piece of hardware you're using as long as it can support your software. So now software is the most important piece in computing. Fast forward, to really the 90s, and we see the explosion of the internet and all kinds of networks. So networks are a way to connect many computers together so that they can have access to the same information across time and place and create a shared understanding of the truth. And so blockchain is an evolution in networks, where in the past, networks are controlled by single authorities. Some of the big internet companies or a government, for example. A blockchain is just a decentralized network. So it is many physical computers that are connected together through a common protocol. And so all of these computers are in sync, they have the same information, and instead of relying on a central authority to make sure that everybody's playing by the rules and that the information on the computers is correct, blockchains use a combination of sophisticated mathematical puzzles and rules and incentives about how people can interact with the network to guarantee that the information on that blockchain is valid and agreed upon by everybody in the network. And so you can trust that whatever you're looking at is valid, even without knowing or trusting any of the other participants in the network. And to kind of get a little bit more specific, people talk about ledgers all the time. And it's true that blockchain can be a ledger, and a ledger is just a fancy way of saying it's a record a database, right? You've got entries in a ledger. The earliest ledgers were handheld notebooks where you just write down something that happened, and over time you have a full history of everything that's happened. So that's one thing that a blockchain can do, and people were excited about it because you could have a decentralized ledger where nobody's in charge of it, but you can have a validated history of everything that happened in, let's say, financial transactions. And that was kind of the first main use case for blockchain, where people wanted to transact something of value between themselves without needing banks or other intermediaries in the way.
So folks have heard of Bitcoin, and they usually almost equate Bitcoin with blockchain. Two different things, but you're just talking about one use case of blockchain technology. One of the original ones was something like Bitcoin or currency.
Yeah, there were early, even before Bitcoin, some early experiments with concepts that kind of turned into what we now know as blockchain. But Bitcoin is the most famous application of blockchain technology. And like I said, it is really effective if you want to transact this digital asset called Bitcoin between people without intermediaries. But that's all it can do. So what's exciting about modern blockchains is that you can now write computer programs that run on a blockchain that do everything that a normal computer program would if you were running it on, say, a smartphone or a laptop. The difference being that instead of running that program on one physical machine, you can run it on all of the machines in the decentralized network. Everybody can be guaranteed of what has happened, but now you can do much more sophisticated tasks. So I could send you the equivalent of an email, or I could sell you a kilowatt hour from some kind of generation asset, and you could pay me back. And so this innovation, the ability to write programs on a blockchain, is really what's driven so much of the excitement and so much of the investment in this space, because people are now trying to figure out how can we create new business models or democratize these systems, or facilitate the decentralization of all different kinds of industries by embracing this decentralized computing technology to interact peer-to-peer or in new types of models that weren't really possible before.
That's what excites me. I mean, I am a huge fan of trying to really apply the peer-to-peer transaction potential to energy, and really starting to see folks have a way to participate in the sharing economy in a way that makes our clean energy assets leveraged far beyond their current value. And so I guess getting us back to the clean energy space, so here at VERGE, we're talking all about how we can accelerate our transition to clean energy and transportation. The folks listening to this program are really the folks that are pushing to try to move faster to meet some of their targets in their own community. So can you just talk a little bit about, what is it about the blockchain technology that's really going to help folks accelerate clean energy and transportation in their communities?
Yeah, well, when thinking about a use case for blockchain, there's a little checklist that I like to go through where you ask yourself, number one, in whatever process you're looking at, are there multiple parties involved who may not know or trust each other, but do they need to validate and agree on some information? Number two is, do you get benefits from a efficiency or a cost or a resiliency perspective from a decentralized computing architecture? And number three, is it inappropriate for one single party to own the data in whatever process that you're looking at? If none of those things are true, blockchain maybe doesn't necessarily need to be a part of a solution. But in the energy space, I can think of a lot of examples where you have many participants involved. There needs to be agreement about some information, and we see opportunities in things like performing settlement for participants who provide some kind of grid service, reconciling information between consumers, a utility, a grid operator, to kind of make it a little more tangible. With Energy Web Foundation, we're working on a handful of projects. One is involved in a settlement process for demand response. So there's a grid operator who wants to have many different types of resources providing flexibility to their system, but there's retailers involved, aggregators, the grid operator themselves, the consumers. There's just a lot of different participants that need to have information flowing between them. And so this blockchain layer can be a common platform and a system of record for those types of transactions to take place. Another project we're excited about has to do with renewable energy credits. Right now, the markets for renewable energy credits are pretty inconsistent across different geographies, but generally they are pretty complex. They involve different parties who need to audit the system, who serve as brokers, who represent people on the generator side and on the buyer side. And as a result, these markets are typically catering to people at the very largest scale, utility scale renewables, large corporate buyers, selling credits in chunks of megawatt hours. And that's just not really practical for most individual consumers. So we're working on a blockchain-based application that can serve as, again, this common system of record with very granular detail into measurement and verification of renewable energy generation, and then the creation of certificates, and then with the click of a button in an app, a secure and transparent way to trade or sell credits from generators to buyers. And our intent is to both make it easier for people to participate on both sides so that more people want to both buy and sell renewable energy. We also want to just make it more cost effective and open up access to people at the smaller end of the size range so that individuals...
Basically homeowners, right? Homeowners with a rooftop solar system.
That's right.
Join a platform.
Exactly. And now anybody, even if you're not even physically in the same grid, I could sell my power to somebody on the other side of the world, and power is not actually the right word, but I could sell a credit for power I generate to somebody on the other side of the world and be compensated for that if somebody values clean energy. And we've also added functionality that can do carbon accounting and actually measure what the carbon abatement is for a particular kilowatt hour of clean energy in a particular location at a given time. And so now we think this can also help incentivize development of renewable energy in certain geographies where it's valued more highly for either its carbon attributes or other.
Yeah. I'm really fascinated to add a third layer of complication onto all this. Some of my background and a lot of my network is focused on community choice aggregation, which is big in California. And I'm sort of interested in one aspect that seems like blockchain could potentially help with unbundled RECs. There's a lot of concern about unbundled RECs in California in terms of procuring unbundled RECs and them not necessarily being as well regulated or verified as some folks would like to see them, or you're not particularly sure where they've come from, which is a concern I know for some legislators. And so I'm wondering if you think blockchain technology could be applied to the validation and verification of unbundled RECs to know that they're not being double retired.
Yeah. So I will caveat that blockchain and any computing system, it's only as good as the information that you feed into it initially. So there is still a requirement initially to ensure that, let's say, if I want to connect a PV system to the blockchain, that we have a way to verify that I actually do have a PV system that I'm connecting and not a diesel generator, let's say. So, that's kind of still a piece that involves somewhat of a bit of human oversight and engagement there. But once you've entered data into the system, now you have a full, secure audit trail of any given digital asset. So let's say for a particular credit, we can trace its origin all the way back to the exact time that it was generated, associate a specific generator that it came from, using digital identities to link the two together. And then blockchain is actually the first distributed or decentralized computing system that managed to solve that double spend problem.
That's right.
And it first applied in Bitcoin, and the challenge was, well, if you have a decentralized network with no authority like a bank to say, when I spend 1 Bitcoin, that I can't also spend that Bitcoin at the same time with somebody else. Blockchains have evolved specifically around that problem. And so we think that it's actually certificates of origin or renewable energy credits are actually a fantastic use case because it does have this potential for double spend. It does require that level of transparency. There are so many actors involved in these markets that it's a really compelling solution.
And in the world, I like to work in transactive energy, but I think just talking about buying and selling energy between many parties, is our REX the currency?
So there's no one-size-fits-all approach to this, and I can speak for what we've done with Energy Web Foundation. The way the EWF origin, which is the name of the application, works is for every kilowatt hour, a new digital token is created with a unique digital signature, let's call it, that can't be replicated. And so now this new piece of data, and that's all it is a piece of data. It's not a physical token. It's not there's no piece of paper that says it's a credit, but it exists.
Arcade, I can take it too.
Exactly. So this exists in the system, and now you can trade it, sell it, claim the green attributes, and when you do, it will automatically be retired and nobody else can use it. And the underlying technology there is pretty robust and proven through some of these other blockchain experiments over the years with things like financial transactions. So in effect, it's almost treating a kilowatt hour, representing it with, you can call it a digital token or a digital credit, but it's representing one-to-one a unit of energy and a digital asset that you can trade.
So, making that information very accurate, verified, and making sure that it's not double counted is a huge benefit to potential CCAs and other types of energy aggregators or utilities even. And I'm actually thinking about blockchain technology as further democratizing even beyond community choice aggregators. And I don't know if community choice aggregators are as big in Colorado, but in California, we were just hearing at the last session that they're going to produce in the next decade or so 70% of they're going to generate and sell 70% of the energy in California. And so to me, I've always been wondering, well, why would an economy limit itself to just two main aggregators, the utilities and local governments that have this authority? Do you see blockchain as sort of superseding both of those main aggregators and just completely democratizing all of the energy transactions in a place like California or anywhere?
Yeah, I mean, when I get asked a lot again, why should we care about blockchain if it sounds like it's just like a regular computing system, but the only thing is that it's decentralized? Well, the decentralization part, I think, is pretty significant. But there's two other, really compelling value propositions, and the first is what we've just been talking about, this ability to disintermediate types of transactions. But the third that sometimes gets overlooked is democratization. And that can be a pretty profound thing if you think about how is your data currently owned and managed when you use different computing systems. In almost every case, you are a user of some other company's product or service, and your data becomes theirs. And we've seen increasing demands for better privacy, better protection. So from a pure computing standpoint, blockchain has the potential to give you more control and ownership over your data. And then when you combine it with these elements of decentralization and disintermediation, you have more choice potentially in how you participate in markets or transactions. You don't need these traditional gatekeepers to enable you to, let's say, transfer a renewable energy credit. We could just do that directly on this system. Our long-term vision is for increasing customer choice, increasing participation among individuals as they continue to choose different types of distributed energy resources, and blockchain playing this role as an underlying platform for performing different resource control or financial settlement or digital identity management functions. So there's, as I always have to throw a little bit of caution, the complexity of this transition should not be underestimated. Right. There's enormous complexity with the physics of a largely decentralized and highly renewable system, and how to effectively maintain the levels of reliability that we're accustomed to under that framework. There are real questions about what are the proper roles for incumbent utilities, network operators, grid operators, regulators, and that regulatory piece is quite significant. And figuring out how to enable customers to express their preferences through action, I think is something that most regulators are aligned with. But again, it's the lights need to stay on. Reliability and affordability are key. Making sure that people aren't left out of the transition. It's really difficult, and it's going to take a lot of time to get it right.
Here at VERGE, we're hearing from a lot of commissioners and utility execs, and there isn't as much resistance as I think a lot of people would think to the concept of decentralization away from utility control or centralized management of the grid. In fact, I think a lot of them have already decided it's essential, it's evolving, it's coming.
Yeah.
But I know there was a lot of skepticism in the room yesterday when we started talking about regulators and utilities and whether or not they would relinquish that level of control, and that's still an obstacle, right?
Oh, it's definitely an obstacle, and the thing I would say there is that not all utilities are quite the same, and actually with Energy Web Foundation, we've partnered with over 70 organizations within the energy sector, ranging from very, very large multinational energy companies to a few person startups in the blockchain space. And so we're seeing these perspectives from a really diverse group of incumbents and new market entrants. And I think it's pretty fair to say that even among the big utilities and energy incumbents of the world, there is increasing recognition that this trend towards decentralization, there's no going back. The economics are pretty clear. You're seeing big centralized power plants struggling to compete in wholesale markets, a lot of these big companies going bankrupt or financially struggling, whereas the cost of distributed and renewable resources continue to plummet. We're getting better technologies to use them more effectively. So the cat's kind of out of the bag. And so these utilities are now asking more of the question, how do we fit into this new world? How do we offer new products and services to our customers? What is the most appropriate role for us as a company? And I think that's going to take kind of a combination of imagination and also potentially regulatory reform, depending on geography, to really kind of reimagine what a utility should be and what roles they should play. I actually am pretty optimistic that this energy transition is going to happen, if for no other reason than economics. Yep. Policy and consumer trends also kind of help. So it's not a matter really of if anymore. It's how do we manage this effectively, and who should be doing what.
It was encouraging yesterday during your session that your co-presenter was from PG&E, which is a giant investor-owned utility, one of 4 in California, and they're already working on pilots. They're one of your affiliates at Energy Web Foundation, which is a nonprofit that Rocky Mountain Institute has helped to found, right?
That's right.
And I am aware that Southern California Edison, another investor-owned utility in California, is also doing pilots actively in Southern California. And so all of that's really encouraging, and I guess I'm wondering what you're seeing on the ground in communities. Are you seeing certain communities take the lead, seeing successes where this is actually emerging for communities?
You know, with respect to blockchain, the most advances are really going on in Europe right now for a number of reasons. Chief among them is there's kind of 2 between the policy mandates for renewable and customer choice energy systems, but also the complexity of those markets make blockchain a kind of a compelling technology. In the Netherlands in particular, we've seen a number of demonstration projects of these blockchain-based peer-to-peer systems, and some distribution grid operators who are working with Energy Web Foundation actually are looking to pilot. They've selected 2 communities who have some existing infrastructure like PV and in-home batteries and some smart loads to start piloting these peer-to-peer type energy communities running on blockchain, that we should see the first experiments later this year in the real world. But by and large, the thing I always also try to emphasize is, despite all of the hype and excitement, blockchain is really still in its infancy. It's going to be research and development for another year or 2 at least, and it's really new technology. There's a lot of challenges to overcome with respect to scale, with respect to performance and cost. So there's still a pretty substantial road ahead to bring this technology to maturity. But again, the early signs are there. The foundational value proposition, I think, is pretty clear, and I think it'll continue to mature over the next few years, and hopefully start to actually benefit people in all types of communities. And the way to get there, I think, is it needs to be easy for people to use. It needs to have a really clear benefit to them compared to the systems that we have today. And it's going to require some innovators out there, either among the utility space or in the startup community, to figure out how to bring new products and services to consumers.
I think there's a lot of folks working in local and tribal governments that like the idea of peer-to-peer energy transactions. They would love to see their homeowners that have purchased solar be able to sell to their neighbors who haven't been able to purchase solar. They'd love to see EV fuel trading happen peer-to-peer. So for now, maybe it's for most local governments, it's something to monitor and continue to learn about, maybe start informing your leadership about. And I know there are some pilots in Brooklyn that are actually up and running, and then another one in Moore Park, California. And I guess I'm just curious what you think in terms of if a local government really wanted to move forward and be a leader here. How would they get involved? How would they start investigating this as an opportunity for their community? What role could a local government play?
Yeah, I'd say the first thing is probably to read as much as you can on the different blockchain technologies that are out there, and what the different trade-offs are, and what specific use cases might be applicable in a given community. There are literally hundreds of companies active in this space that are trying to figure out things like crowdfunding, rural and off-grid microgrids, and doing many of these peer-to-peer type things that you mentioned. So there's some really innovative companies out there that are working on this. I would say the other thing is start to also engage policymakers and energy regulators at the regional level, because I think they're going to be a really important stakeholder to facilitate the adoption of this technology and these types of transactions more broadly. And yeah, unfortunately, I can't point to anything that you can just go buy off the shelf today and plug and play. We're probably a few years from that, but.
Do you think any of I know you have a lot of affiliates with Energy Web Foundation. Are any of your affiliates local or tribal governments, or are any of your affiliates looking to partner with those types of organizations for demonstration sites and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, we have everything from you mentioned PG&E. There's a number of large utilities in the U.S. that, serve communities of all kinds, and they're actively involved in this and trying to think about new ways to serve their consumer base. There's also, as I mentioned, many of these startups, and there are dozens of them that range from, a handful of people up to, mid-sized firms who are very much focused on this democratization and energy access piece as one of their core missions. It's actually one of the things that is exciting about blockchain is there's this real mission-driven attitude towards decentralization and democratization, even among new businesses, and focus on making it a system that's more equitable and more transparent and greater choice for customers. As of now, we don't have any governments of any kind as affiliates in the Energy Web network. We are hoping to partner with them. We want to build as diverse of a community from the private sector, the not-for-profit sector, governments, regulators, grid operators, to make sure that we're getting things right and that this becomes accepted in the energy space.
Well, we can talk more about that offline, but I do have two more questions. So one of them is just big picture question. If we were to look into the future, what do you see, what does it look like? If blockchain is actually successful in the energy space, what does that look like for an average resident in a community? How does that change your day-to-day life?
Hopefully not at all. I mean, that's the real challenge, but also the exciting part is, most of us, even myself included, who I get as excited about this technology as anybody, and I live and breathe this stuff every day. The reality is nobody wants to, have something that's less convenient than what we have now. And actually, you could argue what we have now is pretty darn good. The lights stay on, my appliances work, I pay a bill once a month and don't really have to think about it. That's what it needs to be like for this to actually gain traction. And all of the new approaches need to happen under the hood, so to speak. What I think it's going to take to get there is some combination of incumbent utilities who have significant reach and scale and can bring things to market, but also people in the startup space who can move a little bit more nimbly. And I envision different types of services, like somebody coming to my house one day and saying, you're going to pay me, let's call it, I don't know, $20 a month for all of your energy. I'm going to install, maybe a battery and some other systems to make your house smarter, and it's always $20 no matter what from here on out. And that sounds pretty good to me. And that's, underneath all that is a very, very complicated system, but that's how simple I think it will need to be for any mass market applications to scale.
So, lastly, on a personal note, I really love the Rocky Mountain Institute. I'm a total groupie. When I was in college at Cal Poly, we brought Amory Lovins to speak, and it transformed a lot of opinions back in the day when sustainability was sort of a newer concept. It was a while ago. And so I was just curious about your story and how you arrived at Rocky Mountain Institute with such a cool job.
Yeah, I ask myself that often. I was an environmental science major in college, and was really into kind of outdoor education, and I worked as a naturalist, as a mountain bike guide, and thought I wanted to spend all my life outdoors. And after a few years of living in Wyoming, after school, made it to San Francisco, where I quickly realized I would probably need a slightly higher paying job if I was going to pay my rent every month. And clean energy was something I was kind of interested in, but I ended up getting an internship at a company that was doing demand response and energy software and services. And it just fascinated me how, how dumb our grid really was at that time in light of how smart everything else about the world seemed to be, and all these opportunities for technology to make the grid smarter. And so that kind of started me on this career trajectory of working in this technology and energy space, and worked in the private sector for about 5 years, and wanted to return back to a mountain town, and RMI was hiring, and I was fortunate enough to get let in the door.
Really cool. Well, I want to say thank you so much for spending some time with me and with our listeners, and thanks to our listeners for listening in and hopefully learning a whole lot about a complicated topic that Sam does a good job of making more understandable. And before we sign off, I'd just like to encourage our listeners to share their thoughts on blockchain. Is that something that you are monitoring? Is it something that you think can work in your community? Why or why not? And for more information like this, we hope you'll subscribe to Prosper Sustainably e-news and like us on Facebook and LinkedIn. And we're excited to help your community prosper sustainably. Until next time.